Welcome back to MMA Al Dente. I am the guy who picked Tony Ferguson to defeat Paddy Pimblett. And I'm here to talk about Jim Miller versus Gabriel Benitez. Gabriel is 35 years old, 23-10 as a pro, and he's got the same height and reach as 40-year-old Jim Miller, who is 36-17. And of those 53 fights, I think 42 of them take place inside the octagon. So Jim, he's a living legend. He's setting a new record every time he fights and wins, maybe even loses. And that's why he's already penciled in for UFC 300. And I love that. As a Jim Miller fan, a diehard Jim Miller fan, I'm having a lot of fun speculating about who he's going to fight in April, because I know it's going to be somebody with a high profile. But at the same time, as a gigantic Jim Miller fan, I am very displeased, I'd say, about him fighting in January here against Gabriel Benitez. Because Gabriel Benitez is a very tough matchup. He might be a tougher matchup than whoever Jim's going to fight at UFC 300. But unlike that opponent, Gabriel Benitez has a very low profile. A win over him won't mean nearly as much as it should. He himself has been in the UFC for over 10 years, I think, probably close. And that alone should garner respect from the MMA world, because that's very tough to do. He's had his ups and downs, as I'll get into, but he's definitely an above-average fighter who deserves a lot more respect than he's been given. Gabriel Benitez, he's got 23 wins, 19 finishes, 9 via knockout or TKO, 10 via submission, and then 4 wins via decision. He has 10 submissions, but only 2 of them take place inside the UFC, and they're close to 10 years ago, I'm guessing. Maybe his first 2 wins, they're both guillotine chokes, and the rest of them, the other 8, take place on the regional scene. In general, at the UFC level, he has been much more of a striker and not a big submission threat at all. And on the flip side, he's got 2 submission losses, and both of those take place on the regional scene. So they're probably well over 10 years ago at this point. And he hasn't been vulnerable to submissions either. But in general, his fights take place on the feet, and this guy is a very good striker. He's a southpaw with a missile of a left hand that is more accurate than it is powerful, and it's pretty damn powerful. And he's also got body kicks that can split somebody in half. Just a very hard kicker. And he was a big physical featherweight. This year's at a lightweight. I should have mentioned that at the top of the video. Gabriel Benitez has fluctuated between featherweight and lightweight, and this is a lightweight fight. He has 10 losses, 4 of them by knockout. All 4 of those are at featherweight. He lost to David Onama, Sadiq Youssef, Billy Quarantillo, and Andre Fili. And he was TKO'd on the ground against Billy Quarantillo. That was deep into the fight in round 3. But he got the shit kicked out of him. And he was knocked down standing as well. But he was beaten to a pulp in that fight, where even if there wasn't an official concussion, there was enough damage taken there. But David Onama and Sadiq Youssef I think Andre Fili, too, both caught him in the middle of round 1 or towards the end of round 1. Fili's was a head kick, but the guy has shown a vulnerable chin throughout the years. And now he's 35 years old. I'm sure he's healthier as a lightweight, not having to cut the weight. You know, a lot of fighters like to point to that, and I think there's a lot to that. But still, at 35 years old, with enough concussions in recent past, I think Jim Miller is the healthier fighter at 40 years old than Gabriel Benitez is at 35. And I'm just talking about chins, really, not Lyme disease or whatever. But Gabriel Benitez, he's been knocked out. Probably has, influenced his decision to just maybe play out the rest of his career at lightweight. I'm sure he's recognized that, all of his TKO losses are at featherweight. But in general, knockouts are knockouts. So they've definitely taken their toll. And here he's fighting Jim Miller, who suddenly has knockout power. Jim Miller's only got 7 TKOs in his 36 wins. And half of them or close to it happened in the last 2 years. He got 3 of those. Jesse Butler, Nicholas Mota, and Eric Gonzalez. And look, I'll be the first one to tell you when a fighter's chin is compromised and blah, blah, blah. And if you want to watch my video, which, by the way, like, share, subscribe, all that horseshit. But I made a video this week about Nicholas Mota versus Tom Nolan. And I just spent a good amount of time talking about his chin. So I have doubts about these guys. And I know Jesse Butler, I didn't think he belonged in the UFC. But regardless, you can't deny the power of Jim Miller. I mean, the striking, too. He hit Nicholas Mota with a beautiful, tricky left hand. Uppercutish type of punch. I don't even know what I'd call it, but it was beautiful. Right on the button. Eric Gonzalez, he caught with a big left hand. Gonzalez was keeping his hands down and looked like he was waiting for it. But even the Jesse Butler knockout. Jesse Butler, he just steamrolled in 20 seconds. Jesse Butler, I said he doesn't belong in the UFC. You can watch, he might have the worst chin ever, but you can watch that knockout, and it is visible, undeniable power from Jim Miller. He went through him like a freight train. And even some of his submission wins as of late, in the last 5 years or so. Clay Guida definitely, and maybe Alex White as well. I don't know if that was within 5 years, but he rocked both those guys before getting a submission. I think Jim's power has always been underrated, but now it's got everybody's attention, I think. And the point is, knockout is definitely on the table for Jim Miller here. Whereas a few years ago, I don't think it would have been, even though he's historically the heavier guy. Jim, submission is always on the table. I mentioned Gabriel Benitez hasn't been submitted in well over a decade, but Jim Miller is Jim Miller. He's still one of the most dangerous submission artists in the UFC. And yeah, if he's got a chance at a guillotine, you're in trouble. So that's always on the table for Jim Miller. As far as winning a decision, look, I think Jim has a better chance at winning a decision than he'll be given credit for. He's lost his last 7 decisions, Jim Miller. And I'm not going to get into the competition because there's definitely some guys that are way better than Gabriel Benitez, but some guys where it's a guessing game. But also you have to factor in lightweight physicality. The one thing that I'll say is a trend with most of these decisions is Jim does well and then fades. He's won round 1 and probably over half of those 7 losses, and then lost rounds 2 and 3. He's shown durability, if nothing else, but yeah, Jim is not typically the grinder as of late that he once was. And although that Alexander Hernandez fight, his last decision loss, really could have gone Jim's way with a solid 3rd round effort with that rear naked choke. But here, I think Jim has a better chance at winning a decision than he'd be given credit for because he is the bigger guy. These guys are about the same size anyway. He's not giving up size to Gabriel Benitez. And Jim will probably not give up that physicality advantage. I mean, Gabriel Benitez, not that he's a small guy or whatever, but he's not Scott Holtzman. You know, these big, strong, lightweight athletes that I think Jim won't fatigue as easily. And I also think it'll be easier for him to score takedowns. He hasn't scored takedowns to win a fight by decision since Thiago Alves. And even that guy was fucking gigantic compared to Gabriel Benitez. But here I think Jim Miller could have a little more success trying to bully Gabriel Benitez around. Regardless, I think the majority of this fight will take place on the feet. I do think Jim Miller in a points battle would need his calf kick to come alive, which will be available southpaw versus southpaw. Because if the calf kick isn't dictating the fight and it's largely punches, I think Gabriel Benitez, if his chin holds up, would win that points battle. He's got the sharper left hand, in my opinion. But Jim, I'd favor him to get the knockout, and I think the points battle is very much on the table. Of course, I'd favor him to get the submission as well. My pick is Jim Miller. My pick is him getting the knockout. I think his left hand is going to come alive, and I think he knows it's Gabriel Benitez's primary weakness. So he's going to be looking to crack him. So that is my pick, Jim Miller, I guess by knockout, but definitely my bet is Jim Miller. I've gotten him at plus odds, plus 105. I don't know where it's at now or whatever, but it's fluctuated, and there are no prop bets available anyway. But I'll say this, Gabriel Benitez, I think I could isolate his one path to victory, and it is by decision. I think Gabriel Benitez, I'd be very surprised if he knocked out Jim Miller. I mean, the only 2 guys to do it are Cowboy and Dan Hooker. And those are bigger, better strikers, and more dangerous guys anyway than Gabriel Benitez. And submitting Jim Miller, only Nate Diaz, Michael Chiesa, and Charles Oliveira have done it. And Pat Healy, but that was overturned. But still, even with Pat Healy, Gabriel Benitez is not the grappler those guys are. So, even though Jim is 40 years old and it feels like the other shoe could drop at any second, all of a sudden he's unhealthy in a lot of ways and vulnerable. On paper, in my opinion, the only way Gabriel Benitez can win is by decision. So if you're looking to play that side of the fence, I think you can isolate his path to decision. But Jim is my pick and Jim is my bet. Let's go, Jim Miller. Let's go, rah, rah, rah. Like, share, subscribe, all that horse shit. Check out my other videos.